Hello there, welcome to the second part of this week's Talking Europe on France 24. I'm Catherine Nicholson. For this part of the programme, we're talking about an idea that's a dream for some, but treason for others. I'm talking about the idea of stopping Brexit. Now, for our guest today, it is an achievable reality. Nick Clegg is the former Deputy Prime Minister of the UK. He's just published a book called, quite simply, How to Stop Brexit and Make Britain Great Again. There it is. Now, Nick Clegg, thank you very much for being with us from London.
Thank you.
Let's get straight to the heart of the matter. Yeah. You are a known Europhile, half Dutch, former MEP, you speak 5 languages, your wife is Spanish. You're the perfect profile for a Remainer, aren't you? But is stopping Brexit really doable or just a dream and a catchy book title?
Look, Brexit has not happened. The United Kingdom is still a member of the European Union, and it is trying, as far as I can make out, very incompetently in the hands of this government to negotiate its way out of the European Union, and the government is making a complete hash of it. And Theresa May has said, this is not, I didn't make this up, Theresa May has said that she will submit to the House of Commons, to MPs in London, roughly this time next year, whatever deal she's managed to sort of cobble together with Michel Barnier and the rest of the European Union. And the point I make in my book is simply this, which is that there's no point holding a vote if it's a foregone conclusion. I mean, otherwise what would be the point of a vote? There has to be at least some suspense in a debate and a vote that it might go either way. Mm-hmm. And all I'm suggesting, which seems to me wholly uncontroversial, certainly not a dream, seems wholly uncontroversial, is that when MPs come to debate that Brexit deal, they will be able to compare what was promised to their constituents by Boris Johnson and the rest of them, £350 million a week for the NHS, VAT cuts, smaller class sizes, an economic paradise with lots of new trade deals around the world. They will be able to compare those promises, which were made at the time of the referendum, with the, what I predict will be much more threadbare reality of the deal itself. And I think at that point, it isn't really a question of whether you're pro-European or anti-European. It just seems to me to be a matter of democratic principle that at that point, MPs should say to the government, no, we're going to withhold our consent for this deal because it doesn't remotely live up to the promises that you made to our constituents. And of course, at that point, there will be a crisis and there'll be a great great hullabaloo. But at least we would then stop this juggernaut of entirely false promises. Well, there's a less polite way of putting it, just downright lies by which the Brexit promise was sold to the British people. And I think it's essential that a parliament in a representative democracy does not allow those lies to go unchallenged.
Well, some might say, though, and I've heard this argument quite a few times, what about the will of the people? The people expressed their will in the Brexit referendum.
Indeed.
And Theresa May has said, I will follow that. Brexit means Brexit. Are you not going against the will of the people?
But the will of the people was expressed in the ballot box. You're quite right. 17.4 million people voted for Brexit. 16.1 million people voted to remain. But they voted for Brexit on the basis of a number of very clear promises that were made to the British people. And Brexit, you know, I mean, there's no point. It's not just a sort of 6-letter word. It means something. It has to have meant something to people who voted for it. And we know what that was, not because of any mystery. I'm not making this up. The Brexiteers themselves spelled out what Brexit would bring. And it would bring, they claimed, this great utopia. They said it would bring more money for the NHS. It would bring complete freedom from European judges, total sovereignty over our fishing waters. We would be able to hermetically seal our borders. We would be able to enter into new trade deals, which, according to David Davis, would be 10 times the size of the European economy, which, by the way, is statistically impossible. But never mind, those were the promises they made. And so in a sense, all I'm saying is something which is wholly uncontroversial in a democracy, which is that if you make a bunch of promises and you win a contest in a democracy on the basis of those promises, if you then fail to deliver them, you should be held to account. That is all I'm saying. And by the way, I speak as a politician who was hauled over the coals and roundly criticised for failing to deliver one policy in one policy area when I wasn't even Prime Minister at the time, to do with university financing in the United Kingdom.
Indeed, and we might well come to that. Well, just talking about Brexit, you were in Brussels recently, as you say, as a former elected politician. You were with Ken Clarke and Lord Adonis. You met the EU's negotiator, Michel Barnier. Now, you, of course, were not in any way an official delegation from the UK. No. A lot of Brexiteers would see this as meddling, if not worse. What were you in Brussels for?
Well, it is a free country. One is allowed to meet people if one wants. And I've known Michel Barnier for over 20 years. And I play a role in the public debate, as does Ken Clarke and Lord Adonis. I mean, for heaven's sake, this is the problem. And it is very difficult to explain to audiences beyond the shores of the United Kingdom quite how brittle and vituperative and hysterical the Brexiteers have become, so much so that they now try and stamp out any kind of dissent, and apparently now even scream and screech at the prospect that consenting adults might agree to hold meetings together. It's a free country. Michel Barnier can meet anyone he chooses, and as indeed can I.
So not meddling then by travelling to Brussels?
No, next time I'll remember that if I ever dare have the temerity to step on the Eurostar again towards Brussels, I'm somehow treading on the toes of the will of the people. It's nonsense.
I'd like to talk about... I'd like to talk about someone else who is being accused of meddling currently. Unfortunately, our time is a little bit limited. The biggest backer of Brexit financially, the multimillionaire Aaron Banks, he's in the news this week. He's just been put under investigation by the British Electoral Commission about whether he was the true source of loans made in his name. Just to explain for our viewers, loans that came from outside the UK and Gibraltar were inadmissible for referendum funding. Now, much as in the United States currently, suspicions do start swirling that this could be a sign of Russian meddling in the referendum. What's your take?
Well, firstly, I think it is a very good thing that Aaron Banks, who has always shown, very cavalier and rather arrogant disregard for the regulators who are there to do a very important job, which is to make sure that the rules of the game in an election or indeed a referendum are properly adhered to. And he's always revelled in somehow pretending he's this sort of, political punk rebel who can somehow ignore the rules of the game. He can't, and I have no idea whether he's committed any wrongdoing or not, but the allegations are sufficiently serious such that the Electoral Commission is looking into it, and I hope that they will leave no stone unturned. As for the suspicions that Russian influence may have played some role in the referendum, all I would say is this. It is now an established fact that the Russians or the parastatal organisations linked to Moscow sought to play an active role in influencing the US presidential elections. It is a well-established fact that they tried to do so in the French presidential elections, and that they tried to also influence the German elections too. I would simply ask this: is it really plausible that they should have made a decision in Moscow somewhere to leave the European referendum in Britain completely alone, uniquely of all of these contests in Western democracies, that somehow the Brexit referendum should remain untouched by Russian influence? I find that implausible, but of course there's no point simply dwelling on suspicion. One needs to establish proof and evidence that that is the case. And if that does turn out to be the case, I think that will raise very, very serious questions about the conduct and indeed the legitimacy of that referendum.
All right, question marks over that. There's also a lot of question marks over the nuts and bolts of the Brexit, what it might cost to the UK. We've got a lot of talk about businesses, banks relocating out of the UK, taking jobs with them, of course. EU citizens no longer wanting to work in the NHS has come out in the last couple of days. We're just going to run a report now from our correspondent Hervé Amoric. He's been to see the situation in a couple of places, in Belfast and in London.
This institute at Queen's University in Belfast is at the forefront of the fight against cancer, notably thanks to the many clinical tests carried out here at its hospital research centre.
Pharmaceutical companies are keen to work with us because we can act as a gateway to Europe. So for drugs to be licensed within Europe through the European Medical Agency, they have to have been tested within an EU site. The danger we have with Brexit is that we will be seen to be outside this legislation, and therefore there'll be a disincentive to run clinical trials for our patients within the UK.
These oncologists are worried that this centre will become a victim of Brexit. Their €7 million in funding will run out in the year 2021.
a number of discussions ongoing which maybe have been halted with European partners simply because of the uncertainty.
Once it's left the EU, London will have to keep on paying into certain Europe-wide programmes, like Erasmus, or the non-EU but Europe-wide nuclear energy, Euratom. But before the UK can negotiate new trade relationships with its EU neighbours, it needs to pay what is known as its divorce bill and meet financial commitments it's already made for the next couple of years' budgets. 20, 40, 60 billion or more, the sum is far from clear.
And the European Union has been very reluctant to weigh in the assets. And the UK said, can we please have a proper calculation? So until we see that, I think it's very difficult to say. But my general view about this is we'll end up reaching a fairly amicable solution. We have to.
The issue of how much the UK owes is one of the thorniest of the negotiations. Many British voters opted to leave the EU on a promise they would receive money back from the European Union, not the other way round.
So speaking of the consequences of Brexit, as we record this interview right now, there's pressure on the UK government to release 58 documents detailing the likely impact of Brexit on different areas of the economy. They haven't done so up to now. The suspicion for many is that the contents of those documents aren't very rosy. Do you believe that they will be released? And if so, what kind of impact could that have on the public mood and the public's will to get along with your cause of trying to stop Brexit?
I think they'll have to be released now. Of course, I haven't got the faintest idea what they contain because I haven't seen them, but I strongly suspect that ministers will now be desperately trying to polish the prose and the content of those documents to make them sound as unalarming as possible. I mean, there is a concerted attempt by the sort of Brexit elite that now runs large parts of our press in the United Kingdom and obviously dominates the Conservative Party, to constantly airbrush out the facts and to somehow ignore the evidence which is accumulating by the day, whether it's European nurses no longer wanting to work in the NHS, whether it's investment decisions being put on hold, whether it's the increase of everyday goods in our supermarkets. There's just this constant drumbeat of sort of refusal on behalf of Brexiteers to accept that already now, before Brexit has happened, it's having a detrimental effect on the British economy and on British society.
All right, let's come back to something that you mentioned earlier. Your time as Deputy Prime Minister in the coalition with the Conservatives from 2010 to 2015. As you mentioned, you took some very unpopular decisions, such as the U-turn on increasing university fees. Your party that you formerly led has been hit hard. You lost your own seat in June. Considering everything that has happened since, do you regret not standing up to the Conservatives, even quitting the coalition on a point of principle?
Oh boy, did we stand up. We stood up very well. I mean, many of the signature tune achievements of that government were not were Liberal Democrat achievements, whether it was taking millions of people on low and middle incomes out of paying any income tax, whether it was the massive expansion of apprenticeships, whether it was the huge transfer of money towards the education of the poorest children in our school system, whether it was giving free meals to little kids at the first few years of primary school. I mean, the list goes of pension reforms, energy reforms. Most of the very radical, lasting reforms of that government were introduced by the smaller party, by the Liberal Democrats. So I don't think anyone can look at that record and somehow claim that the Liberal Democrats were not standing up for what they believe.
Well, your party is not the party that's remembered as having made achievements. In fact, it's been punished, we can say, at elections ever since. Do you think perhaps if you hadn't been in that coalition with David Cameron's Conservatives, that he might in fact never have been in a position to get back into government and call the Brexit referendum later on?
The actual reality is, if we had not formed that government for 5 years, the Conservatives, I suspect, would have won the rerun election, which would have had to be held in 2010, and I suspect we would be leaving the European Union even on an accelerated timetable. I stopped the Conservatives from sort of pitching the government into this complete European obsession of them for half a decade. David Cameron was constantly seeking my approval to hold that referendum, which of course I refused. The referendum was only held when the Conservatives were in government on their own. And look, we can spend a lot of time saying, what if, what if? I am immensely proud of what the Liberal Democrats did for half a decade at a time when governments were falling like nine pins across Europe when we were recovering from the worst financial crisis in the post-war period. It is actually the coalition government from 2010 to 2015 stood out as a stable government of great moderation and introduced many of the significant reforms that I've set out to you. The fact that the smaller party, the Liberal Democrats, which I'm afraid appears to be the case in coalitions across Europe, didn't get much of the political benefit from it. Well, that is self-evidently true. But do I think it was the right thing for the country? You bet it was, absolutely.
Well, I'd like to move away from Brexit. We've just got time for one last question about a big news story this week, allegations of sexual harassment, sexual impropriety coming out of Westminster. We've already had the British Defence Minister resign. There are allegations against a lot of people, all political colours. How bad is it in Westminster?
I don't know, I'm not in Westminster anymore, but I hope it will lead not only to a change in the way, obviously, in which politicians conduct themselves, and as is the tendency at moments of great scandal and controversy, a lot of things are being mixed together. I mean, rape and criminal, sexual assault is horrific and illegal and is a criminal thing, and people need to be charged, prosecuted, and if necessary put behind bars. But what is being alleged ranges from that to deeply insensitive, inappropriate, sexist behaviour. But they're not always identical, and in a sense it's all being bundled up together in the controversy. That will need to be looked at carefully in the coming weeks and months. People will need to be held to account. New procedures will need to be put into place. Whistleblowers need to be protected. Vulnerable young men and women both need to be protected when they work in Westminster. But I hope it will go beyond that, because I personally think that this is symptomatic, much as the scandal around MPs' expenses, which occurred some years ago, back in 2008, 2009, was also symptomatic of a political culture in which Westminster just simply hasn't really moved beyond the 19th century. It is an institution still very badly and stubbornly stuck in the past, and I hope this will finally lead to much greater institutional reform in Westminster.
All right, and I'm sure it's a conversation that's going to be continuing on for some days at least. Thank you so much for speaking to us about that, and of course about your book, How to Stop Brexit. Nick Clegg, former Deputy Prime Minister of the UK, with us there on Talking Europe. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again next time.